So I think we'll begin. Welcome, everyone. My name is Marjory O'Toole. Tonight, we're going to hear the history of the Sakonnet people. And this video is going to be recorded. So if anyone couldn't make it tonight, it'll go on our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to access it through our website. There we go. All right, so my name is Marjory O'Toole, and I am the Executive Director of the Little Compton Historical Society. We are going to have questions at the end of the talk tonight. If you have a question, please type it into the chat, and our board member, Steve Lubar, will be monitoring the chat and sharing the questions with me at the end of the talk. But if we don't get to your question or we go too late, you'll see my email there on the screen, and you are welcome to email me at any time. We should do some acknowledgements tonight before we begin. And the first is that we are on Sakonnet land, the traditional homeland of the Sakonnet people. Second, and I think it's a really important point to make, we at the Little Compton Historical Society know that we cannot learn about the Sakonnet people effectively if we try to do it all by ourselves. We cannot do this work alone. We need the help of Indigenous scholars, culture bearers, academic historians, and community members. And at the end of the talk tonight, we're going to discuss briefly how people in the community can help us with this project. And third, we also want to acknowledge that we know we have an obligation to do this work better than it's been done in the past. Certainly, people do the best they can with what they have, and when they know more, they do better. Or when they know more, they do more, and they do better. We, as an organization functioning in the 21st century, have made a commitment to do the very best history of the Sakonnet people that we can do in partnership with Indigenous and academic advisors. I do want to mention very briefly that some of you may have seen a documentary a week or so ago produced by Rhode Island PBS. When we saw the documentary for the first time, we were disturbed to see that their staffers had inserted a number of images into our segment of the video, which dealt with the history of the Sakonnet people, that images that we had not sent them and that we did not approve of. The images were historically inaccurate and in many ways culturally insensitive. And we think it's important for you to understand that those are not the type of images we like to insert into our work or that we want to work with. We contacted Rhode Island PBS. They have been extremely responsive, and they are now working to re-edit that video and re-air it without the images. So we're grateful that they're being wonderful partners with us, and we're all working together to produce the best possible, most authentic, most respectful histories that we can manage. So today, I hope you all think of this as the beginning of a project. We're in the research phase of a multi-year project. And today, we're going to share our current understanding of the history of the Sakonnet people. And that's going to take about 35 minutes or so. At the end of the talk, we're going to also explain the Sakonnet History Project, which will become public-facing in 2025. And we're going to request your help as we move forward with this work. We are definitely not starting from scratch. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight are the histories that we have inherited from the past. Some very bad, and some very, very good. And a lot of the work that we're doing tonight is based on the work of two very good histories, one by a scholar named Tom Callahan, who really sort of reintroduced us to some of the primary sources that had been missing from our work in the past. And also a book that you might be familiar with, The History of Little Compton First Light Sakonnet, written by Janet Lyle 13 years ago, which is incredible that it's been 13 years. But Janet found Tom Callahan's paper in our archive and built on his work. And Janet and Tom, again, reintroduced us to some of the Native people and some of the ideas that had really been lost from our local histories for a long time. And their work has inspired us to do even more as we go forward. So let's start by talking about the tribe that lived here. Our inherited histories, our old histories say very simply that Little Compton is the traditional homeland of the Sakonnet people. Over the last few years, as we've done some preliminary research and we're learning more, we know that the Sakonnet people lived in what is now Western Little Compton, near the Sakonnet River. And that a different band of people with different leaders, the Sakonets, lived in what is now Adamsville and Sakonnet near the Sakonnet River, or the west branch of the Westport River. And as we work on this project, it's probably much more accurate and much more helpful for us to talk about and think about two different tribes living close together, certainly interacting with each other. But those tribes, the Sakonnet and the Sakonnets, were combined into one group of people called the Sakonnets because it was politically beneficial for the English settlers to think of them that way and to work with only one sachem instead of two. The land. As a little girl, I was told the Sakonnets lived in Wilburs Woods. And that's written in many of our local histories. And I think many of us, that's really ingrained in our understanding of the Sakonnet people today. A far more accurate understanding is that the Sakonnets and the Sakonets lived and worked on every inch of what today we call Little Compton and Sakonnet. And just for those of you who don't know, Sakonnet, Massachusetts, Sakonnet, which is now part of Westport, used to be part of Little Compton, and it remained part of Little Compton until 1747. So Sakonnet's native history is Little Compton's native history, and we're going to dive as deeply as we can into that. So regarding Wilburs Woods, let's try to shift from thinking that it's a tiny group of people living in Wilburs Woods to it's a large population of people. One source estimates 2,000 people living here in 1670 before King Philip's War. They did move seasonally, they did move over time, but they must have occupied and used every corner of our community. There is a place in particular that we know the Sakonnets lived, or at least a Washont's band of Sakonnets lived. The record books call it 3/4 mile square. It's sort of a round piece of land that starts just south of Taylor's Lane, and it goes down about to Swamp Road, covers both sides of West Main Road, and you will see it on a map later. And very importantly, it includes the land that the Little Compton Historical Society sits on today. So 3/4 mile square is extremely important in the Sakonnet's history because it was reserved, and they use that word, reserved for Awashonks by officials in Plymouth, by the English officials in Plymouth who owned the land at that time. In 1675, right before the beginning of King Philip's War. Now, what is fascinating and not well understood is that that land was taken away from Awashonks and divided up by the English just a few years later by 1681. And one of the things we really need to figure out in the next few years is why Awashonks was not able to keep that reservation. Colebrook Line is an important piece of the landscape in Little Compton. It is a line that goes north and south in line with Amesbury Lane. And a different sachem, a man named Mamanua, had control of the land east of the Colebrook Line. Awashonks was west of the Colebrook Line. And Mamanua essentially sold Awashonks' land and kept his own. He kept his land east of the Colebrook Line for his people. We also have good evidence that there was an Indian village north of Snell Road in the 19th century. That's another area we really want to study and learn about. And we know that there was an Indian meeting house on the south end of John Dyer Road. That's something we really want to investigate and really want to learn about in the next few years. So lots, and this is just a few, there's many, many more places on the land and in the landscape that we need to think about and study and learn about in order to understand the Sakonnets better. The sachems, or the chiefs, or the leaders of the tribes. We learned as kids that Awashonks was the queen of the Sakonnets. What the primary source documents tell us is that there were many possible sachems of Sakonnet, all living at the same time, and that this was extremely confusing for the English. And there's actually a document where the English recognize and list 5 different people who might be the Sakonnet, the sachem of Sakonnet, and they decide that they need to deal with all of them because they're not really sure who's in power at that moment in time. Awashonks was one, but to the English, even more important was Mamanua, a young man who the English actually settled on being the main sachem of Sakonnet. Awashonks would have disagreed with that. And Mamanua had land disputes going on. Osamihu, or Peter Quacken, is Mamanua's brother, recognized by the English as a sachem. Otsogo is another brother recognized by the English as a sachem. A numpas is a kinsman to Mamanua and his brothers. You kind of get the feel that maybe he's an uncle, but it doesn't say that in the documents. So we're not going to say that because it would just be an assumption. Takakama, whose name is spelled in a variety of ways, is far more important than we've ever realized. He was recognized as a sachem in Awashonks' band. And at times, he is going to Plymouth and acting on behalf of the Sakonnets. He actually went to Plymouth and told them that Metacom and Massasoit had no right to sell Sakonnet, that it wasn't theirs to sell, and he protested their sale of the land. So we'd really like to learn more about Takakama. He was given 1,000 acres of land in Little Compton after King Philip's War. And then for reasons we don't understand, he had his land taken away from him. So that's something we'd like to learn more about. Peter Awashonks is Awashonks' son, but Peter Awashonks has a different father than her 2 other sons, Amos and Simon. And one thing that's new information to us, we really think about Awashonks and Mamanua as dealing with Plymouth. What I find fascinating is that behind the scenes, Awashonks' sons, Amos and Simon, were actively dealing with the colony of Rhode Island, trying to get a better deal than they were getting from Plymouth. They were selling land, large chunks of land, to Rhode Island. Those deeds apparently did not hold up in court. And in those Rhode Island papers, it says that Awashonks designated Amos as her successor, not Peter Awashonks. So we have a lot of new information there that we need to sort through and figure out. And by the way, if I say something tonight and you have a source that says I'm wrong or confirms it, please let me know. And I might not take your word for it, but if you have a good source, I would be very grateful for it, and we'll absolutely take that in consideration as we're learning. If Carlton Brownell was still here, he would tell me I'm in the a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing phase of this project. And before we go public with a book and an exhibit in 2.5 years, we definitely want to make sure that we're comfortable in our information and have everything really well sourced. Land sales. The old histories tell us that the English bought Little Compton twice to be fair to the sachems and to doubly guarantee their right to the land. When we look deeper into that situation, there's a lot more details to consider. The English, the Plymouth colony actively negotiated with both Awashonks and Mamanua and often pitted them against each other. The English preferred dealing with Mamanua, and eventually, in their eyes, he rose to be the chief sachem. And again, Mamanua sold Awashonks' land out from under her, and Awashonks was furious with him. Awashonks did have 3/4 mile square reserved for her. And oops, what I'm going to try to do is move my arrow. I think you can see me moving my arrow on the screen. This area south of Taylor's Lane and there's West Main Road going through the east end of the property. This is 3/4 mile square, and the Wilbur House Museum is probably right about here. For all intents and purposes, this was a reservation for Awashonks, but in 1681, the English divided up among themselves. We need to learn more about that. Wonderful local historians, wonderful amateur historians, wonderful academic historians from time to time send me documents that we have not seen before, and that can really have an impact on the history that we're writing about. Oh, sorry, you couldn't see the arrow on the map. It is that sort of orangey, almost like a circle on the middle left of the map. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that message. A scholar named John Turner, who has written about Plymouth Colony, sent me a letter that Awashonks sent to the governor of Plymouth in 1688. Her son, Peter Awashonks, delivered the letter. And in it, the Sakonnets are landless, absolutely landless. They're concerned about Kelly Sheridan, for whatever reason, like the marks that you're making are showing up. So we're just asked that you stop that if you can. And it'll be different on the next slide. We'll probably be fine. So 1688, Awashonks sends a letter to Plymouth. We have no land. We're afraid we're gonna starve if we can't plant some food. Could we please have some land to plant? We don't know at this moment in time how Plymouth answered them, if Plymouth gave them land or not, and that would be a fascinating thing to find out. And I think the only way to find out, unless someone out there already knows, is to go and read through the colonial records and see if anything pertinent pops up. We've already talked about Mamanua keeping his land east of the Colebrook line. And so that again would be the Adamsville, Quicksand Pond, Acoxa area. Among Mamanua's people, there were numerous native people who owned land with English deeds, and they were able to hold on to their land for a very long time after the war. The English settlers in Little Compton put Mamanua under intense pressure to sell. At one point, they visited him about 13 times in a row. He said no 12 times. And eventually on the 13th visit, he caved to the pressure and sold the rest of his land. We see a number of illegal private purchases by individual Englishmen buying land from the Indians for their own use. That was against the law, and they would get in trouble for doing that. And we're also learning that land sales are wonderful keys to understanding the genealogy and the history of individual Sakonnet families. And we're using those deeds for that purpose whenever we can. English settlement. The short answer regarding English settlement has always been Benjamin Church was the first Englishman to settle in Little Compton. And this is not untrue. It's true to a certain extent, but there's a little nuance to that situation. Benjamin Church was the first Englishman to build a farm in Sakonnet, but he never intended to live there. It was a tenant farm, and he intended it to be a tenant farm. And the first thing he did when the buildings were built, he built two buildings, we presume a house and a barn. The first thing he did was find a tenant to live there. And he leased it to the Hazelton family. Very interestingly to me, the Hazeltons appear to have no women in their family. It was a father and adult sons. One of the adult sons, Charles Hazelton, was Benjamin Church's interpreter with the Sakonnet Indians. So again, Church had no intention of living there. He had a pregnant wife, he had a toddler. This was not a place he was going to take his young family into the heart of the Sakonnet tribe. It was a place where a manly, where an all-male family was going to live and work as the only English people among this tribe of Indians. Technically, John Alney was the first Englishman to buy land from Awashonks. His purchase was 5 or 6 years earlier, and it was because Awashonks had gone into debt, and that land was around Fogling. We have sort of remembered in recent years that Little Compton was a place reserved for the former indentured servants of Plymouth. So these were English men who could not afford to pay their own passage to the New World, and they pledged service to colonists in Plymouth. And when their term of service, maybe 6 years or so, was done, they had the right to purchase land. So Plymouth organized them into a company that we tend to call the first proprietors. And there were, I'm going to say 28, it might be 29, so forgive me if I'm wrong, 28 Englishmen who had the right to purchase land from the Indians in Sakonnet if the Indians would agree. And those people always acted as a company, buying land together and then dividing it up among themselves. Powerful men, more politically connected men like Benjamin Church, Joseph Church, the Southworth family, bought into the company, they bought shares in the company, and they ended up being the leaders of the company. History, local history after local history repeats the phrase that the relations between the English and the Sakonnets were always friendly. That is absolutely not true. I'm reading a book now called Drake's Book of Indians. He uses a couple of sources from the 17th century. Drake is not a good enough source, so I'm reading him just to get used to the idea, and then I'll go back to those original sources, those older sources. But in 1623, Drake reports that there was a plot to absolutely exterminate the English in New England. A conglomeration of tribes was going to attack the kind of weak settlement closer to Boston, and then they were going to come and attack Plymouth and wipe both of them out. And the Sakonnets were part of that group of tribes that agreed to take part in that attack. In 1671, Awashonks refused to turn in her guns. Plymouth was terrified. They were on high alert, and they assembled a council of war, and they decided to draft 100 Englishmen and 40 Indians to go and attack Awashonks in Sakonnet and seize her guns. There was a date set, I believe it was August 5th, maybe August 5th to assemble, and August 8th for the attack. And before that could happen, Awashonks agreed and turned in her guns. And so the attack on Sakonnet never took place. A few months later, Plymouth was reprimanding Philip for a long list of things he was doing wrong. In that long list of things, they used the word especially. They're especially angry with Philip for entertaining the Sakonnets, who are the professed enemies to this colony. So to say that there were always friendly relations, absolutely incorrect. Plymouth was especially afraid of the Sakonnets, at least in 1671. In 1675, during King Philip's War, different factions of the Sakonnets made different decisions. Mamanua and his people in the eastern part of Sakonnet, Nakoksit, decided early on to be English allies, and they actually had the most peaceful dealings with the English because of that early decision. Awashonks made different decisions throughout the war, depending on what was going to work best in the circumstances she was faced with. Because she made different decisions at different times, the officials in Plymouth were not happy with her. She was sort of a half ally, and they did not treat her as well as Mamanua at the end of the war. And then there was a third portion of the tribe, led by a man whose name is Sakonnet Wasuk. He sided with Philip and brought a portion of the Sakonnet warriors with him into Philip's company and fought against the English all throughout the war. At the end of the war, Awashonk's son, Peter, offered to essentially capture Sakonnet Wasuk and turn him over to the English. And we don't know how that turned out. We don't know if he was captured. We don't know if he ever had to appear before Plymouth officials. It would not have gone well for him if he did. During the war, we've all heard about the treaty at Treaty Rock, where the Sakonnets agreed to fight alongside the English against Philip. But the Sakonnets were not always allies during the war. In the early months of King Philip's War, the English came into Sakonnet and burned all of the homes in Sakonnet. The Sakonnets tried to go to Aquidneck Island to take shelter. The English men on Aquidneck Island were patrolling the shores, and they turned them away. The Sakonnets came back and had to hide in the swamps for a while. They then went to the Narragansetts for shelter, and this would be in December. So the Awashonk Sakonnets were in the fort during the Great Swamp Fight, and they were attacked by the English during that battle. The survivors wintered at Wachusett, And for a long time, I always thought, oh, Wachusett, that's a ski mountain. You know, what a horrible place or a rough place to spend the winter. I've learned since then, that there were praying towns, Indian praying towns near Wachusett that are the more likely place for Awashonks people to have spent the winter. When they came back to Sakonnet in the spring, we eventually end up at the meeting at Treaty Rock. At that meeting, Awashonks thought Benjamin Church was going to poison her. These are not people who are happy with each other or who are willing to be allies. During that encounter at Treaty Rock, Benjamin Church starts the discussion with, remember the Pequots. Now, just 20 years before, the Pequots had been attacked and essentially almost killed to the last man. And the people who did survive were enslaved. So this was not even a thinly veiled threat. It's an open threat to the Sakonnets that if they do not do what he says, they will be treated like the Pequots and they will be destroyed, and their women and children will be enslaved. And Benjamin Church goes on to say, I will protect your women and children from slavery. Awashonks and the men go off and have a conversation, and they come back, and their decision is, if Benjamin Church can truly promise that he will protect their women and children from slavery, that they will ally with him. So this is not a voluntary decision. This is a decision made after a threat of enslavement for the women and children. It is not a happy alliance or a happy treaty. It is a coercive one. After the war, both Awashonks Sakonnets and Mamanua Sakonnets petitioned Plymouth for permission to return home. They were treated very differently. Mamanua, who had always been an ally, and his men were allowed to return to a very large area of land. On this map, which is, my hand-drawn notes, you'll see an orange line going north-south. That's the Colebrook line. Mamanua still had control of all the land to the east of that line. And he had control of it, and then eventually it was divided up among different Native individuals. Awashonks maybe went to the reservation 3/4 mile square for a short period of time, maybe not, maybe never really had land assigned to her in Little Compton in Sakonnet. Again, that is something that is not clear yet in the records, and we're going to try to learn more about that. Mamanua's land was on occasion also used as a reward for allies from other tribes, like Alderman, who was a Pecasset, who is the person who actually ended up killing King Philip. Alderman was living in Portsmouth when he received 100 acres from Mamanua as a gift. And then he was living in Dartmouth when he sold his 100 acres to a member of the Brownell family. So Alderman appears never to have lived in Sakonnet or in Little Compton, but he owned 100 acres and sold that land as an investment. We also see that after the war, when the Sakonnets returned home, part of the deal that they were allowed to live here is that they would continue to make themselves available to Benjamin Church and to Plymouth if there were other wars. So the men were obligated to serve as soldiers in expeditions even after King Philip's War, and there were many expeditions, northern expeditions to Maine and to Canada, and the Sakonnets were required to serve in those missions. There is also, even beyond that, a sense of the Sakonnets being a source for hard labor. There is an instance very well documented in court documents where Constance Southworth comes to Little Compton and recruits 9 Indian men, one of whom was called Yehu the Sakonnet, to be deep sea divers on a ship that was going to the Caribbean to try and salvage shipwrecks. The ship was attacked by pirates. Many people died, but Yehu the Indian survived by swimming to an island, and he eventually made his way back to Sakonnet and was called into court to testify about what had happened. So there are these really detailed stories about his experience as a deep sea diver in the Caribbean recruited by Constance Southworth. We know that Mamanua Sakonnets were able to hold on to their land much longer than Awashonks people. If I gave this presentation last week, I would have said that the last sale seems to have taken place in the 1740s. I saw some records at the Old Stone Baptist Church last week that led me to do a little research into an Indian man named John Corey. John Corey and the Quanawan family were still owning land in Akoksik until 1816. So that date is getting pushed back farther and farther, and we might not be at the end of it. There might still be more to learn. Awashonks family. When I was first hired at the Historical Society about 17 years ago, my predecessor, Carlton Brownell, told me that Awashonks had 3 children, a girl named Betty, a boy named Peter, and a youngest son named William, and that William was supposed to go to school to be a minister, but he had seizures, and so he was sent home, and that didn't happen. When you look at the primary sources, that information is incorrect, at least regarding William. There is a letter that Governor Prince of Plymouth writes, where he's very angry at Awashonks' 2 sons because they won't sign the letter of allegiance to Plymouth. And a lot of people have speculated who those 2 sons are. Maybe Peter and William. Other people think it's Peter and Mamanua. You know, who could those 2 sons be? Well, I think that those 2 sons are actually Simon and Amos, Awashonks' 2 sons by her husband, Wewe to Wayet. And I think Governor Prince is angry with them because at the time they're supposed to be signing allegiance to Plymouth, they're negotiating with Rhode Island for a better deal. And they're signing documents with Rhode Island. So Simon and Amos were not opposed to being English citizens, not opposed to an allegiance to the king, but they did not want to do it through Plymouth. They wanted to do it through Rhode Island. And that caused all kinds of problems with Plymouth. It is very clear in the documents that Peter Awashonks is Awashonks' son. It is very clear that she has a daughter named Betty. We are told that her first husband was a man named Ptolemy, or sometimes his name is Tosinoyan. I don't see that. I haven't found that yet in a primary source, just a secondary source. So I'm curious about that. I want to learn more about that. We do know that at the time of King Philip's War, her husband is Wewe to Wayet. He does not seem to have any power of his own. She is the one who has the power in the tribe and the control of the land in the tribe. Mamanua, very important. Somehow he is kin to Awashonks, but that relationship is not clearly defined in anything I've seen yet. Stepson makes a lot of sense, but that's an educated guess. That's not something confirmed by the records yet. What is confirmed is that Mamanua had 2 sons, William Mamanua and John Mamanua. That's very clearly defined in the records. And those are 2 more people that we want to learn as much as possible. As with so many tribal histories, so many New England histories, older histories focus on the end of the tribe. And that is true for the Sakonnets. Most of our older histories talk about Sarah Howdy, the last of the Washonank's tribe, who dies in 1827, and her obituary is on the screen. In 1904, Roswell Burchard wrote, "Of the Aboriginal race, not a vestige remains." In 1970, Notes on Little Compton, which was written by Benjamin Franklin Wilbur and then edited by Carlton Brownell, says, "As far as we can learn, there is not one person in Little Compton with any trace of Sakonnet blood in his veins." So at the time Sarah Howdy's obituary appeared, it was extremely fashionable to announce the end of a tribe. The book, The Last of the Mohegans, had come out. Everyone was interested in the last of the tribe being gone, in large part because that made it easier for other people to feel comfortable living on their land. In reality, the tribes were not gone. In many cases, they were just dispossessed, moved off their land. And that is the situation we have in Little Compton. The Sakonnets survived the war. If you survive the war, you get to have children, you get to have descendants. But Little Compton became a more and more difficult place for them to live. And we see them, well, in some cases, staying put. A large number of what we would consider Sakonnet Indians lived in Acknowledgements. In 1747, Acknowledgements became part of Dartmouth. And so the people that we would have considered Little Compton Indians are now Dartmouth Indians, and they appear in the Dartmouth records and then later the Westport records. But originally they were Sakonnets or Acknowledgements and part of the Little Compton community. We're interested in tracing those families and hopefully seeing where their descendants might be today. Many Sakonnets moved to the Pecasset Reservation. That's very well documented, and I believe the date is 1763. And so among the Pecasset tribe, we would expect to find people with Sakonnet ancestry. And in fact, Chief Daniel Page, the chief of the Pecasset tribe of Massachusetts in Tiverton, we now believe that he has Sakonnet ancestors, and that'll be really interesting for us to learn more about. Sakonnets also moved to nearby cities where it was easier to get work, or they went out to sea. So as we do this work, it's really important for us to remember that the Sakonnets are not gone, but they have moved beyond the boundaries of today's Little Compton. And if we're serious about doing their history, and if we're serious about finding their descendants, we need to widen the span in which, widen the geographic area in which we do our work. This, I think, is fabulous. This is the plan of the Watuppa Indian Reservation in Fall River, Massachusetts. Each box has the name of the person living on that plot, who they inherited it from, and each of the boxes, each of the rectangles with a blue star, the people named in that rectangle, at least in my mind, either have definite Sakonnet ancestry or likely Sakonnet ancestry. So we'd like to follow up on all of those. Not everybody was a sachem. Older histories tend to focus almost solely on Washonank's. I had not even heard the name Mamanua until I read Tom Callahan's paper. And Washonank's is important, and her story is going to be explored and told in our work but we also want to tell, in some cases, the equally fascinating stories of other members of the tribe who would have been considered more ordinary. It's a more authentic history, it's a broader history, and it's going to hopefully connect to more local Indigenous people if we can include more families. So one of my favorite Sakonnet families is the Sakonnet family. We see them in records in the 1600s, and we see them all the way up into records into the 1820s or so. We have Revolutionary War heroes. We have boys being forcibly indentured. We have women being ordered out of town. The Sakonnet family is fascinating, and we would really like to do a good job when we write their story. The Howdies are also very interesting. And this is just a quick graphic that just helps show how much we've learned in the last 8 years. 8 years ago, I made this super simple one-line family tree for a paper I was working on. We knew that there was a Howdy who fought in King Philip's War, and we knew that Sarah Howdy was called the last of the Sakonnets. We didn't know how to connect those people over 150 years. Since then, we've found Captain John Howdy's probate records. We know his wife's name, we know his kid's name, we know his son-in-law's name, and we know that in addition to Sarah Howdy, there was another Native person named Jacob Howdy living nearby near the Westport River. That's a lot of information to help us flesh out the Howdy's family story, and hopefully more for us to learn. Our older histories have the very bad habit of inventing information that is not true. A lot of times it stems from that old game, maybe we all played, of operator, where one person says something and then it goes down the chain, and over the course of 8 or 10 people, it changes into something completely different. So if you go into Wilburs Woods, there are stone monuments to Sakonnet people. One of them has the name Tompe on it, which clearly indicates that the person who installed that stone thought that Tompe was a person. And if you look on old maps, we see things that say Tompe's swamp. Again, looks like Tompe is a person. If you forget all of that 19th century stuff for a while, and you go back to the 17th century deed that sold the first piece of land to the English, there are boundary descriptions that tell us exactly what Tompe was. And it refers to a swamp called Tompe. So Tompe is not a person. Tompe is a descriptive word used to describe a swamp. And if you pay careful attention to those boundary descriptions, Tompe is not in Wilburs Woods, which I once thought it was. It's not Briggs Marsh, which I once thought it was. It is the intersection of Taylor's Lane and West Main Road. Some people know it as Patton's Prairie, but the intersection of Taylor's Lane and West Main Road is not Tompe's swamp, because Tompe wasn't a person. It's a swamp called Tompe. And those are the sort of inventions that we have to try and peel back, go back to the very first source, and try and get a better understanding of what those words really mean. I timed myself earlier today, and I did this all in 45 minutes, and I'm going a little over, and I don't want to keep you all night, so I'm just going to keep moving. We truly have so much more to learn. We have to learn some more history, genealogy. We need to learn from the Wampanoag language, and we are working with people at the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project to try and learn about the words like Tompe or Tuthos in our old deeds to try and figure out what those are. We can learn from the landscape, in some cases with archaeology, which we hope to use in the future. Material culture, incredibly important. And just to share with you one pet project of mine that I really, really want to try and understand. We're looking at the proprietor's map. This map shows the name of the first English person who bought each parcel of land in Little Compton. And near the blue arrow is something very unusual. It's the only Wampanoag word that remains on the map, and it's Tayon Song. And if you look at the old records in the proprietor's book in the vault in Little Compton, Tayon Song appears over and over and over again as a boundary. People are describing things near Tayon Song, but they never tell us what it is. We do not know what this land was. It was not immediately owned by an English person. It was left unowned, unassigned. It was left with a Wampanoag name. You can see there's a road leading into it. It's now probably covered by the Watson Reservoir. The Wampanoag language speakers say that many of our words have been adulterated over the years by English use. So it's hard for them to connect to their original pronunciation and meaning. So we don't know what Tayon Sunk means, but it's something that I would dearly love to learn more about. And I think it would help us understand the history so much better if we could. And that's just one example of the projects, special projects that we're going to try and approach in order to learn more. So we are in the research phase of the Sakonnet History Project. It's a major multi-year project that the Historical Society has undertaken. Right now in the research phase, we're trying to learn as much as we can. We're visiting with tribes, museums that have excellent Native American displays. We're going to historic sites. Private individuals are inviting me to their homes and their fields and their forests to walk and learn about the landscape. We're doing preliminary presentations like this, especially with the local tribes, with other groups as well, to let people know what we're doing and to ask for help early on in the project. We're going to be doing oral histories with tribal members if they agree. We're looking at primary sources, secondary sources, material culture, and we have some fabulous archaeology plans, and we'll do as much as our pocketbook will afford. In 2025, the history of the Sakonnet people, or I think it's better to say a history of the Sakonnet people, because someone will come along in 20 years and do an even better job. We will share with the public an improved archive and collection of materials. We will have a new book. We'll have a permanent exhibition on the grounds of the Historical Society that will tell the history of the Sakonnets. We will have a temporary exhibit up for that summer and a series of public programs, including lectures. It's about 2.5 years from now. We'll do this lecture over, and I hope that we are going to have answers to some of the questions that we've raised tonight. We do need your help. If you are a researcher and you have something that you think is helpful, please share it. I saw some names of people like Richard Gifford who signed up, who are superb researchers, and Richard has been sharing his work with us, and it's incredibly helpful. So if you've been doing similar work and just sort of keeping it to yourself, but you're willing to share, now would be the time, because it could make a big difference. We're working on genealogies. We're working with a man named Andrew Pierce on Wampanoag genealogies. It's Andrew's specialty. We're asking you to share your family histories. It might just feel like a story, but there could be a grain of truth in that story that would be very helpful or would help connect. We are looking for Indigenous essayists to contribute to the book, academic and Indigenous reviewers to check our work before it goes to publication, Indigenous artists, from whom we would purchase illustrations for the book, Indigenous craftspeople, from whom we'd purchase items to add to our collection, and help, as always, planning public events that in 2025, we hope would include an Indigenous Artisans Festival and maybe even a powwow, which I think would be a wonderful thing to bring Wampanoag culture back to the land that was originally reserved for Awashonks. And finally, we need funders. And, sometimes asking for funds is an intimidating thing, or it makes you feel uncomfortable. With this particular project, I am very comfortable asking for financial help because I believe in it so much. I believe in its importance. And if you're inclined, we could use help anytime between now and 2025 to accomplish all that we want to do. And we are committed to doing the best possible work we can on this project. We have other things going on publicly. This year, our theme is inspired craft. Next year, our theme is going to be transportation. But behind the scenes, we're dedicating our staff time, our resources to working on the Sakonnet History Project as much as we possibly can. And one commitment that we're very happy to make is that this project is not going to come to an end. We're not going to be done with Sakonnet history in 2025. We will always be interested in learning more about the history of the Sakonnet people, and we will always include what we have learned in all of our future projects. So I thank you all very much for your attention. And Steve is going to, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Steve is going to check the comments, the chat, and see if there are any questions.
Great. Well, first, I will just second what Judy Melanson said in the chat. Marjory, you are amazing. It was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. There's one question that I'm sure many of the listeners have, which is, what do land sales really mean? Did the Sakonnet people and English think the same thing when they were selling land? Did they have the same meaning? Could you say something about that?
Sure. So I have given this a lot of thought, and certainly I have come across the idea that Native people did not have the same concept of land sales, that they believed it was more a right to use the land, not a permanent separation from the land. But I want to point this out. We're talking about 1670. Because of where Sakonnet is in the very far reaches of Plymouth, as far away from Plymouth as you can get, the Sakonnets were protected in many ways from the interference of the English for 50 years. And although they were protected, they were always observing, always hearing what was going on with their neighbors, always alert to what was happening and learning. So by 1670, the Sakonnets, and this is my opinion, the Sakonnets absolutely knew and understood what a deed meant because they had been witnessing it for 50 years. They saw what it meant to all their neighbors, most especially Aquidneck Island. Aquidneck Island was sold. I mean, you can literally see what's happening on Aquidneck Island. Aquidneck Island was sold, and the Native people had to leave Aquidneck Island. They were forced to leave Aquidneck Island unless they remained as servants. The Sakonnets saw this, they understood this, they knew what was going to happen when they sold their land by English deed. They did not like it, but they had no choice. And these are the hard choices that they had to make in order to survive a situation that was almost unimaginable to us today.
Thank you. Another question, and that's the relationship between the Sakonnets and the Wampanoags. Did they speak the same language? Were they a part of the Wampanoag tribe of the nation? How did that work?
My understanding, and I always defer to Wampanoag scholars on this, is that the Sakonnets were a village or a tribe or a band, whatever you care to call them, within what today we know as the Wampanoag Nation, Wampanoag territory. Massasoit certainly put himself forward to Plymouth as having control of Sakonnet. Not sure the Sakonnets always would have agreed that Massasoit had control of them. And certainly they objected when Massasoit sold Sakonnet to Plymouth.
Did they speak the same language?
I believe so. And again, always defer to the Wampanoag language folks who I am learning from. But I think language is one of the best ways for us to understand which tribes were most closely related because of the subtle differences in language. And it does, it clearly seemed that the Sakonnets spoke what we now call the Wampanoag language.
There's a bit of a complicated question about the Dartmouth Purchase and whether Mamanua had agreed to that earlier on. Can you comment on that, on what the Dartmouth Purchase is? Just tell us a little bit about the
I haven't read about that yet.
Okay.
So I'm not going to comment because I'm ignorant of it now. But learning, it's so interesting being a little Compton historian. So often I can say, oh, that's Tiverton. I don't have to understand that. Or, oh, that's Westport. I don't have to understand that. And it's sort of this beautiful way to limit my workload. With Native people, that doesn't work. I have to understand what was going on in Tiverton. I have to understand what was going on in Dartmouth. And I am aware of that document and I have to read it and study it, but I haven't done that yet.
Good. I think there are many fine compliments in the chat, and including some offers of financial support, which I'm sure we will follow up on. And I'll just mention that Marjory mentioned at the beginning that this talk will be on our YouTube channel. And if you're interested in helping out or in more information, get in touch with Marjory and just give your email address again. That might be a good place
Sure.
to.
So my email address is the main address for the organization, which is lchistory@littlecompton.org. The best way to give, there's lots of ways to give. We've got a donation button on our website. We, we're so happy for donations in any format. The donation on the website, send us a check, stop by with a gift. We probably all know this, there's sort of like general funds, and then there's restricted funds to a special project. If you want your gift to be restricted, only used for the Sakonnet History Project, just make a note of that and we will honor that request.
Great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you all. Did you notice, Steve, how many people were with us tonight?
Yes, we had almost 200.
Yeah, that's great. That's a nice big crowd.
Right.
There were 328 people signed up, and I was like getting nervous because it's a big group. But we always have attrition with Zoom programs, so close to 200 is fantastic. I'm thrilled, and I thank you all for spending your evening with us. On April 4th, We have what promises to be a very interesting talk by Christian McBurney, who has written about the Revolutionary War, and it focuses on spies, Revolutionary War spies in Rhode Island. That is an in-person program at the Congregational Church on the Commons at 7 o'clock on April 4th. And it will also be live streamed if you are not able to join us in person. And you can see the link on our website, which is littlecompton.org. Right. Thank you all. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
I think we'll copy the chat before we get offline here. Save chat. Okay, good.
Goodbye.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. All right, good night, everybody. So nice to see familiar faces. And we had new people tonight too, and that's just as great. There's Jane. Hi, Jane. And Anne. So do we remember Romper Room? I have an slightly unusual name, so she never said hello to me, and it was like heartbreak every morning not to be seen in the magic mirror at Romper Room. But it's nice to see your familiar faces. Fred Bridge is on, but Fred doesn't show his face. Oh, there he is. Good night, Fred. Good night, everyone.